I might have just accidentally discovered the most broken Bazaar build, and it's a Dooley build. I have been playing this build back to back all day, multiple different iterations of it, and I haven't lost yet.
You should know, I'm a bit of a legend on Pelago.
So here is our incredible Dooley build. Sadly, I don't have the shot from the very end of the run because it did that thing where the items overlap, so you're just going to have the in-game one instead. Let me go over the key concepts, the key pieces of this board. Then I'll go over the variable other little bits you can add on, some items that are used earlier on, as well as some items that you can slot in, and then of course the skills that make the build churn. So the key concept of this build is your core. And not just your core, but the core tag. And we're using this in a few ways. So first and foremost, we have the regular core, just what the core is. At the absolute base tier, we're using the normal core here, the core. Every 7 seconds, it deals 10 damage, and it charges all the items to its right by 1 second. Every time you use an item to its left, it charges by 1 second. Nothing incredible, but once you start scaling it and actually give it some damage, because this is a regular weapon damage core, if you buff it with regular damage things, the more you trigger it, the more it's going to hurt. This thing can carry you through the early game. With one skill in particular, I'm going to pick up most of the skills later on, but like clockwork is not necessary for this build. I've run this build without it and 10-1 without it, but if you get day 1 like clockwork, along with one of the weapon-based cores, yeah, this build can absolutely pop off. 10 in 10, very easy. The next key item that comes into this is our other core, the combat core. This large silver item at its base tier damages and shields for 25 at base, and then every time an item to its left is used, it gains damage, and every time the item to its right is used, it gains shielding. I forget what the absolute base silver tier is, although it's probably up on screen. But we want to get this to diamond, because at diamond tier, it's getting 50 damage and shield every time its passive triggers. This thing can become an absolute wrecking ball and is the sort of core centerpiece of damage and sustain in our build. So we have a beautiful core of our build. Those are 5 item slots between 2 items, both of which are cores, both of which want to scale. One of them helps you use items very regularly, i.e. the core. The other one wants you to use items very regularly, i.e. the combat core, so that it can scale. So we need to fill in the rest of our gaps with things that go quick. Now, there are a few options, but I think there are some very, very honorable mentions. First and foremost, my favorite combo, if I was going to absolutely pick the perfect build, would be a missiles, a capacitor, a remote control, and then probably a light bulb, although the final slot is somewhat up to what you need. The key one for me there is missiles. This, what starts off as a silver medium item, every 3 seconds, multi-casts, dealing 10 damage. So that's basically a cast per 1.5 seconds. You're going to struggle to find anything quicker than that on Dooley. There is a gun, a weapon, that also is a 3 second with multicast if it's adjacent to a friend. That is a decent substitute to missiles, but missiles is what you're really looking for. She is an ammo-based item, but she reloads when you use the core. And we have 2 cores, and preferably a remote control, which I'll get into now in a second. So she's going to be reloading very regularly. She's going to be casting incredibly quickly. This is probably one of the lowest time to kill builds left in the game, because if you can get missiles down to around a 2-second cooldown, you can kill your enemy within 4 or 5 seconds without any problem. So what she's going to be doing is triggering. She's going to be to the left of both of our cores, so she's going to be giving 2 times 50 damage to our combat core, so 100 damage every time she triggers. And she's going to be twice charging our main core, and the only item to the right of the main core that I run in these builds is the remote control. The remote control at, I believe, bronze or silver at its lowest tier should be every 10 seconds use your core, but if you get it to diamond, it becomes every 6 seconds, and then if we're charging it with our base core, if you get the base core, and you can charge it, it fires off even faster. And because we have 2 items with the core tag, you probably guessed it, this uses both of your cores. So you normally get to a state in a battle where the second time missiles will trigger, you will activate your combat core and your main core for the second time, and they'll activate again immediately for the third time because remote control will go off. Which means you're getting 3 core activations. Basically, your entire build goes off 3 times within 4 to 6 seconds. That is generally the vibe we're going for with this build. There are a bunch of other items you can have. Obviously, we've still got 2 small slots. In this particular example, I ran with a light bulb, which is a 3-second cooldown item, pretty damn fast, that grants adjacent items 2% crit chance. I tend to put this between my 2 cores, so they're both getting crit chance. In this particular version, it was the only item I didn't have very well upgraded, so it was still bronze, only giving a tiny amount of crit chance. But if you can get this to gold or even diamond, it can be your solo source of crit chance, and you will start critting enemies during this fight, because this thing will be charging incredibly quickly. And then, of course, because it's charging quite quickly, it's charging our core, which is charging our remote control, and it's also giving some shield to our combat core. I do like to have a little bit of balance on the combat core. I tend to lean more to damage than shielding, but having some things on the shielding side isn't a problem. That being said, if you are struggling to churn through some of the tankier Pygmalions out there, maybe Dooley shields, then feel free to move Light Bulb to the left-hand side and give your combat core a little bit more damage. The other item we were running with in this particular build was GPU. Every 4 seconds at base, it hastes the core for 1 second at bronze tier, 2 at silver, 3 at gold. We eventually had it at diamond, so it was triggering, it was charging hasting for 4 seconds every time it activated. There we go. Another pretty damn quick cooldown item. There is a better choice than the GPU though. The capacitor absolutely breaks this build. If you can get the capacitor, especially at diamond, it's a passive item, so it's taking up an item slot and it's not triggering, so that can be a little annoying. But the fact that missiles is triggering twice every 3 seconds at base, without any haste, without any other forms of activation, she's triggering twice every 3 seconds at base. With a diamond capacitor, you'll be charging your rightmost item 4 seconds every 3 seconds. So if you have that remote control in your rightmost slot, then missiles capacitor is absolutely going crazy. If you don't have a remote control, you can put a number of things there. GPU can be a decent option. You can genuinely just put the core in the rightmost slot. Or there are options or examples of times where I've put the combat core itself in my far rightmost slot, so that missiles is triggering that an immense amount of times. Capacitor. Some other small items I like to run, if you're running the replacement missiles, the multicasting weapon that requires a friend, First Aiden is probably your best bet. A 4-second cooldown, small friend who hastes an item every 1 second, for 1 second when it triggers, and heals when you haste. Typically, we run as much haste as we can through skills in this build as well, so you're getting a little bit of healing, which helps you against the rampant poison builds right now. But mostly, it's just there for a small friend if we need one. And of course, if you can't roll GPU or capacitor, then it can take that small item slot. Another option is Beta Ray. I actually think this one's a little bit underrated, especially if you find some of the skills that freeze when you use your weapons or cores. Beta Ray can be really, really nice because you're generating a lot of haste on top of it from using 2 different cores, and then just generally slowing down your enemy, freezing their build an awful lot, which allows your combat core to ramp up in both damage and shielding. That's something you've got to kind of keep in mind as you're playing this build. I mostly address this with skills, but if you can get stuff that starts to slow your opponent down, they're very, very good. There are some skills out there that slow or freeze your entire enemy's build when you drop below half health. I love both of them. Petrifying Gaze, I think, is the one that you get from the Medusa-like NPC. They're both fantastic options. Anything like that that can slow your opponent down. You can even run cool LEDs if you need it and don't find Beta Ray, which I think is just a better option, just so you can get more stacks of your combat core going. Quick shout out before I go into some of the earlier items, because this definitely is one of those builds that sort of pivots in the middle stages, and I'll give you some tips on that just now. But schematics, I ran this time, which was a lot of fun. It's the first time I've ran it, but it actually worked quite well. You just leave this in your stash, and every time you upgrade an item, it gains value. If you can upgrade it, it also gains a ton of value. Anything you can do to add value to schematics to eventually sell it. I ended up getting this to, I think, 64 value. So first of all, I sold it for 64 money, which was very sweet. But that also gave 64% crit chance to both my core and my combat core. Very, very good item, definitely worth grabbing. And one more very quick shout out, scrap metal is insane with this. I'm going to use this to sort of pivot into generally how I run this build. But scrap metal, medium item, silver tier at its lowest. When you sell this, upgrade the core. And it upgrades both of them at the same time. So, how you want to play this build is you want to get, hopefully, you get like clockwork, so your core is actually doing damage. Your first few days, your core is going to be your key weapon. You're going to have it all the way on the right. Focus on XP as much as you can while keeping your board full of small, fast-firing items, right? You don't want to rush XP so much that the core is your only item on your board, because then you've done nothing with that XP. You want to try and be hitting a new level each day and filling your board with small items to the left of your core. You're not going to win every single one of these fights. You're going to come up against stronger early game builds. That happens to Dooley. Like clockwork is the only chance I've had at consistently winning those early fights. But if you do get like clockwork and you are leveling consistently, you can actually go 10-0 with this, as I did in this particular run. So yeah, very, very important early on to get those levels, fill your board up, have all those small items triggering your core, hoping to get the win. You also want to hold money as much as possible. I don't mean don't buy anything, I just mean keep rerolls to an absolute minimum until at least day 4-5, because that's when we're going to start seeing silver tier items. So before I jump into that, some of the important items that you can get early on. I think Uzi is fantastic, a 2-second small item. It's got 12 ammo, so it will eventually run out, but this is going to trigger your core a bunch of times. A bunch of the items we've already spoken about. GPU is great, First Aid, and if you can get him, is great. Chris Army Knife is great. Any small item that triggers remotely quickly is great for this early phase of the game. As we transition into that middle stage, around days 4, 5, 6, you want to be looking for any vendors that sell you weapons, medium items, or large items specifically. We are on the lookout for missiles and combat core. So Barcoon, who only sells medium and large items, can give you those, although he's rolling from a much larger pool. You've also got Pol, who only sells large items, and around day 4 or 5, I think it might just be that Dooley has a very small pool of silver and bronze tier large items, but I've hit combat core more often than not with Pol in those middle phase days. So go to Pol, make sure you have the money to buy a combat core. It's going to cost you 12 gold. Go there, grab that as quickly as you can. Mittel is also fantastic. She only sells medium items, and you want a bunch of them. Most importantly, missiles, but you can also get the multicasting gun, which I always forget the name of. You can also get the scrap and the schematics from Mittel as well. So Mittel, very, very good. The reason why I said you're supposed to save a lot of money going into days 4, 5, 6 is because you're going to need to do a lot of re-rolling in these days. You need to hit vendors pretty much every single time and be re-rolling to make sure you're getting your very key items of a missiles and a combat core. The rest are extras, but just make sure you get those 2 items online. If you don't, then don't worry. You can get them a little bit later. They do still come up quite frequently. You just have to stick with your current core build, and it's going to start to really get a lot weaker against opponents you're coming up against. Especially if you didn't get like clockwork at this point, you're going to have to pivot into a new build, right? You didn't hit the build, go find a new one. You've got other items, right? But if you do have like clockwork, you can hold in there probably until, I want to say about day 6 or 7 before, I mean, at that point, you've probably lost your run, but good luck. You might find it. And if you do find it, then you can pivot in and it immediately switches on. Before we move on to the tier rating of the build, I just want to quickly go over some of the key skills. As we said, like clockwork is fantastic. Petrifying Gaze and other things that slow your enemy down are also very good. Captain's Charge is one of my favorite items to get, or favorite skills to get in this build. The first time you use a large item each fight, haste adjacent items. If you can get it to gold tier, it's for 8 seconds, and at silver tier, it's still 4 seconds. You have a large item, it's going to be a short cooldown. Combat Core starts at 4 seconds, and by the way, most feathers and insect wings I end up putting on my Combat Core just because it triggers things like this. It's going to trigger pretty early. You can either use it to perma-haste missiles, in which case every 1.5 seconds you're getting 2 activations of everything, which means 0.75 seconds per activation, which is insanely fast and one of the fastest things you can even remotely possibly do in the Bazaar. So yeah, really good for hasting that. If not, you can always just haste your light bulb, which is giving yourself crit chance, haste the other items you've got around. Haste in general is never a bad thing, and just gets your build moving a lot faster. So here we are in our build tier list, our build ratings. Once again, we have 5 different places we're going to rate the build on. It's time to kill, its tankability, its survivability, how replicatable it is, and then whether it can go late with scalability, or whether it can 10 out of 10 go 10 wins in 10 days. First of all, time to kill. I think this is currently the fastest time to kill build out there. At least it has the potential to be. Now, I know Vanessa daggers still very much exist. They can have an insane time to kill, as can like yo-yo spam. If you get an instant trigger and 2 yo-yos. There are some crazy builds that can, but for builds that are remotely consistent, spoiler alert, this one is, this is probably the most consistent, of the most consistent builds, this is the one with the lowest time to kill. Incredibly fast, as I say, within about 6 seconds, you normally get 3 activations of both your cores, which is enough to kill anyone. Tankability, this one is, or survivability, this one's kind of up to you. You can put your core, your combat core, more to the left or right, depending on how much you want. So I'm actually going to give this an A. And I don't think there are many builds out there that are going to have an S tier time to kill and an A tier survivability. If you manage to get some crit chance on your combat core, and you have your regular core to the right of it, it can skyrocket in its potential. You can be shielding for thousands and thousands and thousands with very little investment in your survivability. And of course, we are always already looking at those skills, Petrifying Gaze and such skills to slow the enemy down to give us that chance to scale. So as that is part of the build, in my personal opinion, survivability is an A for me. Replicatability, or the ability to replicate the build, this is going to go in A or B for me. And I'm going to put it in B for this particular reason. So you can run this build with any weapon core. It is most strong with the core. In fact, it is, we're basing this build on the core, but assault core is also pretty decent. You are going to be running crits most of the time, so it can synergize with that, but you lose the accessibility to charging remote control quite as quickly. And then weaponized core, I have won this. I won a gold victory, not a 10 in 10, but a gold victory in ranked with a weaponized core. Supposedly the worst core in the game, unwinnable core. It was actually pretty easy. The early game was a little awkward. You have to maybe put some items to the right of the core to benefit from its scaling. But once I got into it, and once I specifically found capacitor, that is when the build completely unlocked. So for those the core builds, if you're using assault core or weaponized core, capacitor becomes kind of like a must-have, and you need to really start digging for it. And it's not the easiest item to find. That being said, it can work. So I'm going to put the replicatability at a B, but it could be an A. It's close. It's somewhere in between, but I'm not going to do middle roads. It's going in B. And the reason why I'm putting it in B is because with most of these builds, I'm going to be saying, okay, it's either late game or it's early game. One of them is going in an A. The other one is going up here. So is this build late game, or is it 10 wins in 10 days? The answer is yes. Yes, it is. So let me go through one by one. 10 wins in 10 days. This is pretty much only possible with the core. You can maybe get it with Assault Core, but with the core, 10 wins in 10 days is perfectly possible, especially, and maybe this is another caveat, only if you get Like Clockwork. So maybe this actually ends up being a B. Maybe I did overrate its ability to go 10 in 10, which makes sense because it's not that repeatable to go 10 in 10. You do need to get Like Clockwork, and you need to get one of the 2 better cores. That being said, the 10 in 10 feels really good. Like, no one comes close to stopping you if you get Like Clockwork, the core, and some good items early on. Right? That you are unstoppable. Equally, if you get into the late game, this build scales incredibly well with skills. There are things like the buddy system skill, which gives you a flat 5% reduction on your only friend if you only have one, and your core, in which we have 2. That's at silver tier. You can get that gold and even diamond. We're only running one friend. It's usually missiles. Sometimes it's first agent if we're running the weapon instead. There are so many skills that you can start to adapt from this. And part of this is because we're running a large, medium, and small item. We're hitting a lot of different categories. There are a lot of really powerful skills you can get. And so long as you're getting skills to help you survive and activate faster, the scaling comes from the core. And we get a diamond core pretty fast. I got a diamond core, I think day 4 in this build. It's either day 4 or day 5, where I have a silver core and I find a scrap metal. And then I go to Pole looking for another core, a combat core, upgrade my combat core, sell the scrap metal, diamond day 4. So yeah, its late game scalability is incredible. Its 10 in 10 is pretty damn good, just less consistent. So overall, this build can kind of do it all. Let me know what you think of this build. Let me know if you've tried this. And yeah, how many chests do I help you win? For more guides, more builds, and more news, you know what to do.